The rain came down in sheets, blurring the neon lights of downtown Asheville into a kaleidoscope of color. But it couldn't drown out the ache in Julian Carter's chest. He stood under the awning of a shuttered bookstore, clutching a soggy cardboard box of his belongings, the last remnants of a life he'd thought would last forever. 3 months ago, he'd been in love now. He was just another 24-year-old with a broken heart and a lease he couldn't afford. Julian's phone buzzed. A text from his best friend. "Mia, you sure about this? Moving in with him?" He didn't reply. What could he say? That he had no choice. That the only affordable room in this overpriced tourist town belonged to Ethan Caldwell, his ex-boyfriend's older brother. The same Ethan who'd always been too kind, too steady, too present in a way that made Julian's pulse race even when it shouldn't have. He shoved the phone into his pocket and trudged toward the address scrawled on a crumpled post-it. The house was a craftsman-style bungalow on the edge of town, its porch sagging under the weight of ivy and time. Julian knocked, his knuckles hesitant against the peeling paint. The door swung open, and there was Ethan, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that carried the same sharp jawline as his younger brother, Lucas, but softened by a quiet warmth that Lucas never had. His blue eyes locked onto Julian's, and for a moment, the world stopped spinning. "You're soaked," Ethan said, his voice low, like the rumble of distant thunder. "Come in." Julian stepped inside, dripping onto the hardwood floor. The house smelled of cedar and coffee, a stark contrast to the sterile apartment he'd shared with Lucas. Ethan took the box from his arms, their fingers brushing for a split second enough to send a jolt through Julian's veins. He cursed himself silently. This was a mistake. Ethan was Lucas's brother, his landlord. Nothing more. "You didn't have to take me in," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper as he followed Ethan to a small bedroom at the end of the hall. The walls were painted a soft gray, and a single window overlooked a backyard where fireflies danced in the rain. Ethan set the box down and turned, his gaze steady. "You needed a place. I had one. Simple as that." But it wasn't simple. Not when Ethan looked at him like that. Like Julian was more than the guy who'd been dumped by his brother. More than a tenant. More than a mess. It was the kind of look that made Julian feel seen, like he still mattered in a world that had stopped caring. The first week was a tightrope walk. Julian tiptoed around Ethan, hyper-aware of every glance, every accidental brush in the narrow kitchen. Ethan was a carpenter, his days filled with the scent of sawdust and the hum of power tools in the garage he'd converted into a workshop. Julian, a barista at a trendy cafe downtown, came home each night smelling of espresso and defeat. His dreams of becoming a graphic novelist buried under student loans and self-doubt. One evening, Julian found Ethan in the living room, a beer in hand, staring at a photo on the mantel. It was Lucas, grinning with that effortless charm that had once swept Julian off his feet. The sight of it twisted something in his gut. "He's in California now," Ethan said, noticing Julian's gaze. "Chasing some tech dream. Left without much of a goodbye." Julian swallowed the bitterness rising in his throat. "Sounds like him." Ethan's eyes flicked to him, searching. "He hurt you bad, didn't he?" The question hung in the air, heavy as the rain outside. Julian wanted to lie, to shrug it off. But something about Ethan's voice, gentle, unguarded, pulled the truth out of him. "He made me feel like I was nothing, like I'd never be enough." Ethan set the beer down, his jaw tight. "You're enough, Julian. More than enough." The words landed like a punch, stealing Julian's breath. He turned away, pretending to study the bookshelf. But his heart was hammering. Ethan didn't push, didn't say more. He just stood there, a quiet anchor in the storm of Julian's emotions. By the second week, a fragile rhythm emerged. Julian would wake to the sound of Ethan's tools in the garage, the steady thunk of a hammer grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. Sometimes, Ethan would leave a mug of coffee on the counter, still warm, with a post-it note that said, "Don't burn the place down." It was a joke, but it made Julian Smiley a real smile, not the forced one he wore at the cafe. One night, after a double shift, Julian collapsed onto the couch, sketching in his notebook. Ethan wandered in, wiping sawdust from his hands. "What's that?" he asked, nodding at the page. Julian hesitated. His art was private, a sanctuary for the stories he didn't dare share. But Ethan's curiosity wasn't demanding, it was soft, like an invitation. Julian flipped the notebook around, revealing a sketch of two figures dancing under a starry sky, their silhouettes intertwined. "It's beautiful," Ethan said, his voice hushed. He leaned closer, his shoulder brushing Julian's. "You've got a gift." Julian's cheeks warmed. "It's just something I do. To escape." "Escape what?" Ethan's eyes were on him again. That same piercing look that made Julian feel like he was the only person in the room. "Everything," Julian admitted. "Lucas. Myself. The fear that I'll never be more than this." Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for a pencil and added a small detail to the sketch, a crescent moon above the dancers. "There," he said. "Now it's perfect." Julian stared at the page, then at Ethan. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was drowning. But the past wasn't done with them. Late one night, Julian's phone lit up with a text from Lucas. "I'm coming back to Asheville. We need to talk." Panic clawed at Julian's chest. Lucas, with his easy smile and cruel indifference, was a hurricane waiting to tear through his fragile peace. He didn't tell Ethan, but the weight of the message followed him like a shadow. The next morning, Ethan found him in the kitchen, staring blankly at his coffee. "You okay?" Ethan asked, his voice soft but laced with concern. Julian wanted to spill everything about Lucas, about the way his heart still ached, about the fear that Ethan's kindness was just pity. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Ethan didn't push, but his gaze lingered, as if he could see the cracks Julian was trying to hide. And when Ethan reached out, his hand resting briefly on Julian's arm, it felt like a promise one Julian wasn't sure he could trust. As the rain pounded against the windows, Julian knew one thing: Lucas's return would change everything. And he wasn't sure he was ready for the storm. The days before Lucas's return stretched like a taut wire, each one humming with tension. Julian threw himself into his shifts at the cafe, pouring lattes and forcing smiles. But his mind was a battlefield. Lucas's text had reopened wounds he thought were healing, and Ethan's quiet presence only complicated things. Every glance, every shared coffee, felt like a step towards something Julian wasn't sure he deserved. Ethan seemed to sense the shift. He didn't pry, but he was there, leaving a plate of pancakes on the counter one morning, inviting Julian to watch a cheesy sci-fi movie on the couch, his laughter filling the room when Julian mocked the terrible special effects. It was easy, too easy, to fall into the rhythm of Ethan's life. But the closer they grew, the more Julian's guilt gnawed at him. Ethan was Lucas's brother. What kind of person falls for their ex's sibling? One evening, Julian found Ethan in the garage, sanding a cedar table with slow, deliberate strokes. The air was thick with sawdust and the faint scent of pine. Julian leaned against the doorway, watching the muscles in Ethan's arms flex, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. It was a moment so ordinary, yet it stole Julian's breath. "Need something?" Ethan asked, glancing up, his blue eyes catching the light. Julian hesitated, clutching his sketchbook. Just wanted to show you something. He opened to a new drawing-alone figure standing on a cliff, staring at a stormy sea. It was raw, jagged, a reflection of the chaos in his heart. Ethan set the sandpaper down, wiping his hands on his jeans. He studied the sketch, his expression unreadable. "This is you, isn't it?" he said finally, his voice soft. "Standing on the edge. Not sure if you'll jump or stay." Julian's throat tightened. "How do you do that? See right through me." Ethan's lips curved into a small, sad smile. "Because I've been there. On that cliff. Wondering if I'd ever be enough for someone." The confession hung between them, heavy and raw. Julian wanted to ask who had hurt Ethan, who had made him doubt himself, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he stepped closer, their shoulders brushing. "You're more than enough," he said, echoing Ethan's words from weeks ago. Ethan's gaze softened, and for a moment, Julian thought he might lean in, might close the distance between them. But then Ethan stepped back, clearing his throat. "You should get some rest," he said, turning back to the table. "Big day tomorrow." Julian nodded, retreating to his room. But sleep wouldn't come. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the memory of Ethan's voice looping in his mind. He was falling, and he didn't know how to stop. Lucas arrived on a Friday, striding into the cafe like he owned it. His blonde hair was longer, his tan deeper, but the cocky grin was the same, the one that had once made Julian's heart race. Now, it just made him feel small. "Jules," Lucas said, leaning on the counter, oblivious to the line forming behind him. "You look tired." Julian forced a smile, wiping his hands on his apron. "What do you want?" "Lucas." "To talk. Catch up. I messed up." "Okay. I know that." Lucas's voice was smooth, rehearsed, like he'd practiced this in a mirror. "I want to make things right." Julian's stomach twisted. He wanted to scream, to tell Lucas how he'd spent months picking up the pieces of his shattered confidence. But the words stayed locked inside. Instead, he muttered, "I'm working. Can we do this later?" Lucas shrugged, like it didn't matter. "Sure. I'm staying at Ethan's place. We'll talk there." The words hit like a punch. Lucas was staying at the house. With Ethan. With him. Julian's hands shook as he poured the next customer's coffee, spilling it on the counter. That night, the bungalow felt like a pressure cooker. Lucas sprawled on the couch, a beer in hand, talking loudly about his startup dreams in California. Ethan sat across from him, his face unreadable, while Julian hovered in the kitchen, pretending to clean dishes. Every laugh from Lucas grated on his nerves, a reminder of the months he'd spent trying to be enough for someone who never cared. "You're quiet, Jules," Lucas said, glancing over with that infuriating grin. "Still mad at me?" Julian's grip tightened on the sponge. "I'm not mad. I'm over it." Lucas laughed, like it was a joke. "Sure you are. Ethan, tell him to loosen up." Ethan's eyes flicked to Julian, sharp and searching. "He's fine," he said, his voice steady. "Maybe you should give him some space." The room went quiet, the tension thick enough to choke on. Lucas raised an eyebrow, but he didn't push. Instead, he launched into another story about Silicon Valley, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Later, when Lucas passed out on the couch, Ethan found Julian on the porch, staring at the stars. "You don't have to talk to him," Ethan said, sitting beside him. "You don't owe him anything." Julian's eyes burned, but he didn't look at Ethan. "He's your brother." "And you're—" Ethan paused, his voice catching. You're more than just his ex. Julian, you're you. The words cracked something open in Julian's chest. He turned, their faces inches apart, the air electric with unspoken truths. Ethan's hand twitched, like he wanted to reach out, but he didn't. Instead, he stood, his voice barely a whisper. Get some sleep. We'll figure this out. Julian watched him go, his heart pounding. He didn't know what this was, Lucas, Ethan, or the feelings he couldn't name. But one thing was clear, the storm was here, and there was no escaping it. The next morning, the house was a battlefield of silence. Lucas was still asleep on the couch, snoring softly, while Julian crept past him to the kitchen. Ethan was already there, pouring coffee, his movements deliberate, like he was trying to hold the world together with each careful pour. Julian wanted to say anything, but the weight of Lucas's presence pressed down on him, suffocating. You didn't sleep, Ethan said. Not a question. He slid a mug across the counter, the steam curling between them. Julian wrapped his hands around it, the warmth grounding him. Hard to. With him here. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out a sketchpad from the drawer. Julian's sketchpad, left behind in the garage. Found this, he said, opening to a page Julian hadn't shown him, a drawing of Ethan, his face half lit by sunlight, his eyes soft and searching. It was intimate, vulnerable, a confession Julian hadn't meant to make. You drew me, Ethan said, his voice low, almost reverent. Julian's face burned. It's just a sketch. I draw what I see. Ethan's gaze met his, steady and unyielding. What do you see when you look at me? The question was a spark in a room full of gasoline. Julian's heart raced, his mouth dry. He wanted to say everything, that Ethan was the only one who made him feel safe, who saw him as more than a failure, who made him want to be brave. But before he could speak, Lucas's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Well, isn't this cozy? Lucas stood in the doorway, his grin sharp. You two getting close? Julian flinched, but Ethan didn't move, his eyes still locked on Julian. Go back to sleep, Lucas, he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. Lucas laughed, unbothered. Relax, big brother. Just didn't expect to find my ex shacking up with you. The word stung, but it was Ethan's reaction that hit harder. He stepped forward, his shoulders squared. He's not your anything, Lucas. Not anymore. The air crackled with tension, Lucas's grin faltering. Julian wanted to disappear, to run from the weight of both their gazes. But he stood frozen, caught between the past and something new, something terrifyingly possible. The rest of the day was a blur. Lucas lingered like a bad habit, filling the house with his presence, while Julian buried himself in work, sketching furiously in his room. But the drawings weren't enough to quiet the storm in his mind. Lucas wanted to talk, but every word out of his mouth was a reminder of why Julian had fallen for him and why it had been a mistake. That night, Ethan knocked on Julian's door, holding a small wooden box he'd carved himself. Made this for you, he said, handing it over. The box was simple, with a crescent moon etched into the lid, echoing the sketch they'd worked on together. Julian ran his fingers over the carving, his throat tight. Why are you so good to me? Ethan's smile was soft, tinged with something like longing. Because you deserve it. And because, he paused, his eyes searching Julian's. Because I see you. Julian. All of you. The words were a lifeline, pulling Julian from the edge of his doubts. He stepped closer, his heart pounding, and for a moment, he thought Ethan might kiss him. But then Lucas's voice echoed from the living room, calling for Ethan. and the moment shattered. The breaking point came the next day. Lucas cornered Julian in the cafe during a slow shift. His charm dialed up to 11. "I was an idiot," he said, leaning close. "I want you back, Jules. We were good together." Julian's hands shook as he wiped down the counter. "You left. Lucas. You didn't even say goodbye." "I know. I messed up. But I'm here now." Lucas reached for his hand, but Julian pulled back, his heart racing. "No," he said, the words stronger than he expected. "I'm not yours to take back." Lucas's face darkened, but before he could respond, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his presence like a storm rolling in. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with warning. Lucas smirked, stepping back. "Just catching up with my boy?" "He's not your boy," Ethan said, his eyes never leaving Julian. "He's his own person, and he's done with you." The cafe went quiet, customers glancing over. Julian's chest ached, not with pain, but with something near relief. Maybe, or the first sparks of courage. He looked at Ethan, standing there like a shield, and realized he wasn't alone anymore. That night, Lucas packed his bags, his departure abrupt and unceremonious. Julian watched from the porch as his taillights disappeared, a weight lifting from his shoulders. Ethan joined him, their silence comfortable, heavy with possibility. "I'm sorry about him," Ethan said finally. "He's my brother, but he's not good for you." Julian turned, their faces close in the dark. "And you? Are you good for me?" Ethan's breath hitched, his hand brushing Julian's. "I want to be," he whispered, "if you'll let me." The days after Lucas left were a quiet revolution. The house felt lighter, like it could breathe again, and Julian found himself lingering in the spaces where Ethan was watching him work in the garage, sharing coffee in the mornings, their conversations stretching late into the night. But the fear lingered, a whisper in Julian's mind. What if this is just a rebound? What if I'm not enough for him either? One evening, Ethan invited Julian to a local art fair, a small event in downtown Asheville where vendors sold pottery and paintings under string lights. Julian brought his sketchbook, nervous but curious, and Ethan stayed close, his presence steadying. At one booth, an artist complimented Julian's work, asking if he'd ever considered selling. Julian laughed it off, but Ethan didn't. "You should," Ethan said later, as they walked home through the crisp autumn air. "Your art, it's not just an escape. It's who you are." Julian stopped, the streetlights casting shadows across his face. "You really think I can do it? Be more than this?" Ethan turned to him, his eyes fierce. "Julian, you're already more. You just need to believe it." The words settled deep, chipping away at the doubts Lucas had left behind. Julian reached for Ethan's hand, tentative at first, then bold. Ethan didn't pull away. Instead, he laced their fingers together, his thumb brushing Julian's knuckles, and they walked the rest of the way in silence, the world falling away around them. The first test came a week later, when Ethan's parents visited. They were kind but traditional, their smiles tight when they saw Julian's belongings in the house. Over dinner, Ethan's mother asked about Lucas, her voice laced with hope that he'd settle down soon. Julian's stomach churned, but Ethan's hand found his under the table, a quiet anchor. After they left, Ethan found Julian in his room, staring at his sketchpad. "They don't know about Lucas," Ethan said, sitting beside him, "or about us. But they'll come around." "Us?" Julian's voice was barely a whisper, his heart racing. Ethan smiled, soft and sure. "Yeah, us. If that's what you want." Julian's breath caught. He wanted Ethan. Wanted the way he made him feel seen. Wanted the future they could build. But the fear was still there. A shadow he called in rectangle. His eyes pleading. Ethan, I don't know if I can do this again. Not after everything. Ethan took his hand. His grip firm. You're not doing it again. This is different. We're different. Julian nodded, tears stinging his eyes. I want this. I want you. They kissed that night. Under the stars. The world soft and quiet around them. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning, not an end. Months later, Julian stood at the art fair again, this time with a booth of his own. His sketches sold faster than he'd expected, each one a piece of his heart on display. Ethan was there, carrying boxes, cracking jokes, his pride in Julian brighter than the string lights overhead. They were building something together, not just a relationship, but a life. A life where Julian wasn't defined by his past, but by the person he was becoming. One night, as they lay in bed, Julian traced the lines of Ethan's face, memorizing every detail. You still look at me like I matter, he whispered. Ethan pulled him close, his voice a vow. Because you do. Always will. And in that moment, Julian believed him. The past was just a shadow now, fading in the light of what they'd found a love that saw him. Not as an ex, not as a tenant, but as someone who was enough. More than enough.